So the Parkin site also has a very famous, or not, no, let me start over. So the Parkin site also has a top secret murder mystery that's very interesting to me because I'm obsessed with the flood of 27. In 1927, the Mississippi and all of its tributaries flooded. Extreme flood. At least a third of Arkansas was under at least 8 to 12 feet of water. We're talking about a major flood. The White River, the Arkansas River, the St. Francis River, they were all out of their banks. A third of the state under that much water. It was endemic. Tons of loss of life, life-changing and altering. Many of the residents of the state that had to flee never came back. Many residents from east of us that were coming this way to try to get away from it got caught up in its grasp as well. In 1927, it hit Parkin very hard. The people that weren't able to evacuate, because of things like levees breaking, they did know that there was flooding going on, but it kind of rose slowly and everything was okay until a levee broke, and then it was all of a sudden there and really scary. It wasn't like you had a lot of warning, but most people with means had already left. Others that had not left, the only thing sticking out of the water in town was the mound, which is some 40 feet from ground level. They were waiting up there to be rescued by boats. It was months that Parkin was underwater before the people could come back. And again, many of the Parkin residents that were working for the mill, maybe like a woman that cooked meals for the guys that were working, or worked in the boarding house for the single men, maybe some of the men that worked for the mill but still had families to feed and couldn't wait 3 or 4 months without a paycheck. Once they'd gone west to places like Oklahoma or Texas or California, they got new jobs and they never came back. But many residents did. And when they came back, they decided that there had been so many floods back to back. There was also a horrible one in Parkin in 1912 from the St. Francis, and the cemetery, the town cemetery from when it was founded, was always underwater during these floods. And people in town got really sick of wanting to go visit Grandma, and Grandma was underwater. It's just not respectful. It was too close to the river, and they had a meeting and they decided they were going to do something about it. So they moved the historic cemetery, the first one in Parkin, a little bit away from the river so that it wouldn't be flooded. Now, this left people with a quandary of what to do. Do we go and dig up Grandma, because that could be kind of bad business, and move her? Or do we just move her stone and say we moved Grandma, because who's going to know anyway, right? So some people did that. Some people just moved Grandma's stone and said they moved Grandma, because you don't really want to move Grandma after she's been underwater for months, and we won't go into the whys on that. Others did move their family members, and there's still many stones that stand there, people that didn't have family. There's a gentleman, a German gentleman, that's buried there whose family probably never even knew that he died, because he had worked in Ohio and then of course come to Arkansas, and whether he got them word, I'm not sure, but he died in the flu pandemic after World War I and was buried there in the Parkin Cemetery. So there are people like him who are still there. But anyway, when it became time to start this new cemetery and move people, one particular family decided that they were going to move Grandma. And so they started digging, and they dug a little bit, and they dug a little bit, and they saw a hand, and they dropped the shovel and they said, "Oh my gosh!" Because it wasn't Grandma, because Grandma was in a casket and this is just a hand. And I oftentimes would tell kids that I was telling the story to, it was a girl hand. And how did you know it was a girl hand? Well, because it didn't have hair all over it, right? But anyway, it was a girl hand. They stopped what they were doing. They knew that Grandma was who was in the grave, and underneath this woman. They knew when Grandma was buried, she was the last burial before the flood hit in 27. So someone had put this poor woman in this grave. She appeared to be young. She'd been murdered. So they set one person from their family there to guard the grave. The rest of the family went to go get the sheriff, who was in Wynne, Arkansas, some distance away by horse, several hours before they could locate him and get him back. And when he got back, the lady wasn't in the grave anymore. The guy who was left to watch her said that he ran back home for just a couple minutes to get something to eat. He didn't know what had happened to her. But the family and others in town assumed that he was actually the murderer, and that this poor woman was someone either that was fleeing the flood or, the Depression, which technically started in 1929, but in the South, crops had been going south for a while, and the Depression here started a little bit earlier. Everyone says the flood really started it. So she could have been, just trying to find a better way of life, single, ended up in Parkin, ended up getting murdered. And if you have a body back then, and you don't have a car or a way to transport it, a way to get rid of it safely, probably your best bet is in the middle of the night to go stick it in the grave with grandma while nobody's looking. No one's going to look there because everybody already knows there's a body there. So the family who still lives in Parkin won't allow us to say their names because obviously they feel like the murderer was related to them. But it's a very interesting murder mystery here in Parkin. We'll never know who she was or how she met her demise because she disappeared. And years later, someone in the family did tell us when we were interviewing him that he threw her into the river.